Good evening and welcome to tonight's Young Adult Thriller panel for Oz Authors Online. Tonight I'm joined by three fabulous authors and generally just three fabulous people, Ellie Marnie, Sarah Epstein and Lily Wilkinson. Ellie is the author of 9 traditionally and independently published books, the latest of which, None Shall Sleep, is about 2 teenagers who are recruited to interview teenage serial killers. It was released on September 1. Sarah has 2 published novels, the most recent of which is Deep Water, published earlier this year, which follows the investigation into the disappearance of 13-year-old Henry Weaver from a small country town. Deep Water has been nominated for several awards, and her debut novel, Small Spaces, was recently optioned for film. Lily Wilkinson has written a whopping 14 books, and I had to count twice to make sure that was right, for a mixture of all ages. Her latest book, The Erasure Initiative, which was published in August, is about a group of people trapped on a self-driving bus with no idea of who they are or how they got there, who are then asked a series of moral conundrums. I'm tonight's moderator, Alice Boyer Endacott. Under the name A B Endacott, I have independently published 6 fantasy novels. I'm the secretary of Love Oz YA, and I'm a member of the OAO org team. Before we move on, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we virtually gather today. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching here today. It is important to remember that the sovereignty of the land was never ceded. We write and we live and we read on Aboriginal land. So my first question tonight is quite a simple one, and it's for all 3 of you. You've all written very different books that are all under the thriller genre. So what exactly does thriller mean to you? And let's start with Ellie.
What does thriller mean to me? I tend to be pretty plot-based when I think about that question. So for me, it's about what is driving the story. And in the case of a thriller, the villain is always driving the story in a thriller. So it's always the evildoer who is doing nefarious deeds, and the protagonists are chasing after the villain, trying to catch them before anything worse happens, basically. So the protagonists are basically just reacting to what the villain of the piece or the antagonist of the piece is doing. So for me, that's identifying a thriller. Very different from like a mystery or something like that. They all fall under crime, but they all have different drivers.
Yeah, definitely. So Sarah, what would you say defines thriller for you?
I think for me, I would say it's just unputdownable entertainment for me as a reader. And so that's how I like to try and craft my stories that I write. So I suppose it's just an entertaining mystery, and it's just got to have things like a hook, tight pacing, red herrings and clues, all that kind of thing. And it's just about crafting a story that just makes it really hard for the reader to put down at any point, because you don't want them to put it down. So for me, I would literally classify it as unputdownable entertainment.
Yeah, and I certainly couldn't put down any of your books, actually. Much to the chagrin of my poor boyfriend when he was trying to go to sleep. So Ellie, what would you say is a thriller?
I reckon I've just kind of made this up in my head as you other guys were talking, because you've said what I was going to say. But I think that for me, it is that unlike a mystery or like a detective story where the protagonist is somebody sort of who's outside the action, trying to solve it, sort of looking in and trying to solve it. It is about someone who's right in the middle of it. It's sort of, you are embedded in the action. So there's a lot of narrative traction. It is all about plot. It is all about unputdownableness. And it is about someone who is like right in the middle of a mystery or drama. It's usually got quite a bit of action in it, usually elements of crime, and a lot of danger for the protagonist. It's about sticking the protagonist in a lot of danger and seeing what happens.
Cool. And I mean, I feel like you've all sort of answered this, but I'll still throw it out there. And Lily, I'll start with you because we'll go in reverse. What do you love about writing thrillers?
I am like a plot junkie. I really, really love plot. I love designing plots. I love putting them all up on my pinboard, and I love organizing twists and reveals. And a thriller is the perfect vehicle for that. So I really, really love being super strategic about plot and like putting all my pieces in place, putting together that jigsaw puzzle, and then hopefully doing it in such a way that the reader can put it together as well.
Cool. Sarah?
I think it's just, to me, it's just storytelling. So I think that's what I get out of it. Is I've just always loved to tell a yarn. So for me, if I can hold somebody's attention, whether I'm just, telling them an anecdote or a dinner party story or writing a thriller, for me, it all just comes in the basis of of storytelling and entertainment. So I think probably why I love it is because I love to read it. And when I was a teenager, I loved those type of stories. They just grabbed me, they captured me. And so I'm just trying to write for the teen that I was, but also for the teens of today. But I just want to entertain people. I guess that's just me in a nutshell. I love to tell stories. So, what's really fun about thrillers is, as Lily was saying, just crafting a story, figuring out where your clues, you're going to pepper your clues through, and your motivations for all the characters to make it quite character driven. All of that's just a really fun challenge. And so, yeah, it's just really the fun of crafting quite a complicated story and stringing the reader along till the end.
Awesome. And Ellie?
Why do I like to write thrillers? I think because they're the kinds of things that I like to read. I really like to write the thing that I would like to read myself. And I am the kind of person who likes to be engrossed in a page turner. I like to feel that compulsion to keep moving through the story. I also think, being part of a thriller where the protagonist is always trying to catch up to what the villain is doing, and there's this strong sense of danger all the way through, and this sense of precariousness. It's really that emotional immediacy, that I really find gripping, and that I just want to be, you were saying, you're embedded in the story, and it kind of really grips you emotionally because you're writing it. And that's the sort of thing that I like to be swept away by a really good story. And that's what thrillers do for me. So that's why I like to write them.
Those are all really lovely answers, actually. And I think Sarah's and Ellie, actually, there's a really great Frost quote, I think it's Frost, that says, we spend our lives rewriting the first poem that we fell in love with.
Yeah.
And I think that's so true for writing. Like the book that you love as a teenager is the book that you're eternally trying to do justice to, which is just a lovely thought. So, and I think, well, it's not quite a direct lead on, but I'm always interested, and I think I've spoken to all three of you, and you've talked about independently, and you've talked about YA thrillers in particular and the emotional immediacy that comes with a YA voice and a young adult protagonist. And I'm quite interested to know what your take is, what all of your takes are on why YA thrillers are particularly unique or particularly distinct from other types of thrillers. So, Sarah?
Well, interestingly, I write a YA thriller probably just exactly the same way as I'd write an adult thriller. So I suppose, for me, I craft it the same way. I'd approach the structure the same way. I suppose, though, why I choose YA is, again, it's based in that idea of that's what I enjoyed when I was a teenager. And so the last time I actually wrote fiction before I started writing it as an adult, after having a full career in something else, was when I was a teenager. So for me, when I started writing fiction, I just picked up where I left off with that same teenage voice that was in my head when I was a teenager. So, and for me, it just comes very naturally. But in terms of crafting the story, I'll just create it the same way that I would create it for adults. But what's really interesting and unique about writing YA is you've got protagonists who are not necessarily they still have to answer to their parents, and they're in situations where they're a little bit powerless sometimes, and they're very hormonal, and they're trying to find their way in the world. So the way they would approach the things that are thrown at them and those sort of situations are very different to the way an adult protagonist would. So it creates a whole other set of complications. And often with YA books, we do see an element sometimes of having a love interest or romance or something like that in a thriller, or not necessarily romance, but some kind of romantic link or relationship. But the way I approach that, again, is very much steeped in writing for YA, and that is, it just becomes another complication. So I don't approach it the way I would possibly approach some fling or affair that an adult protagonist might have, that they can sort of handle alongside whatever else they're handling. It becomes a real big complication with teenagers, with teenage characters. So I suppose for me, in terms of how I approach it, would be just the same as I'd structure any story for any age group, but just the kind of things that teenagers are dealing with just create some really fantastic complications and different motivations for them than what adults would have. And, obviously there's angst in there too, which we all love in YA, and it really adds a whole other layer to the story. So.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting answer, because, and I think I was talking with you, Ellie, about that being a teenager is kind of like a horrifying time in some ways.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting point. Like, there is the first things that most people are part and parcel. The new discovery is an additional element. So could you speak a bit more to that, Ellie?
Yeah. Yes, I do think being a teenager is kind of a horrifying time. I mean, you're going through a lot of changes, and that's like a terrible puberty joke, but so you're dealing with aspects of body horror. Also, the world is really scary, and you're being thrust out into it and starting to think about assuming an adult role in the world, and that is kind of scary. The world is very complex and intimidating, and you don't even have a driver's license yet, that sort of thing. And also the expectations on teenagers are different. We expect them to act like grown-ups and make more adult, more mature, level-headed decisions, but their brains aren't fully evolved. So there's a lot of stuff on teenagers. And you look at the world now. I mean, COVID is scary. Climate change is incredibly scary. So yeah, I just think a combination between the combination of teenage protagonists and thriller writing is actually a pretty good, well-suited combination. Writing YA thrillers for me is always about making sure that the teenage leads have agency. I mean, to me, that's what a YA story is about. It's about the teenagers who are the main characters in the story driving the narrative. They make the decisions that move the plot forward. So, in a way, having a YA thriller, a teenager reading a YA thriller, seeing a teenager like themselves make decisions that make things happen, that push the story forward, that have real life repercussions. And yeah, I think that can be a little bit empowering on some levels. And I also think, we've had discussions before, Alice, about the idea that scary stories teach people how to live with being scared and teach people resilience. And that's not a bad thing for kids and teenagers to learn right now.
No, absolutely not. And I think that leads really beautifully into talking about Lily, because I think in some ways the Erasure Initiative was a lot about how do we navigate the world and how do we make decisions. So I'm just going to throw the ball to you, Lily.
Yeah, I don't know what I can add, because Sarah and Ellie were both just super eloquent. I think Ellie's really right in that YA is about power and powerlessness and agency. I think that YA, the thing that everybody's always like, what is YA? But I think that the thing that YA always is that it's about young people learning to negotiate with the institutions that shape them, whether that institution is your family, whether it is your school, whether it is your religion, whether it is the FBI, whether it is a cult or like a weird science person who is doing experiments on you, like whatever it is, like it is about that negotiation, and it is about trying to figure out how much power do I have, how much power do I want. And it is about trying to take all of the power and then realizing that all of the power is actually not what anybody wants, and then trying to figure out how to move forward and exist in a world that is shaped by these institutions. And so I think that all of that goes so beautifully with the engine of a thriller, because it thrusts a teenage protagonist into that world, into those institutions, and immediately puts them in peril. It puts them in danger. And so that negotiation becomes very, very fraught, very, very dramatic, and therefore very, very interesting, very readable. So I think that it is really, really about that idea of agency. And also, as Sarah was saying, like it is about that intensity of adolescence as well, that, you know, adolescence is firsts. It's, you know, the first time you've fallen in love. It's, you know, the first time you've been betrayed by a friend. It's the first time you've had your heart broken. And, you know, all of that can only make a book more interesting and fresher. And I think also, certainly with the Erasure Initiative, in fact, I think in all of the three books that we're talking about, the protagonists are very idealistic. You know, they have these really, really strong ideals and these strong expectations of how other people should behave, and particularly how the adults around them should be behaving, and that they have become disappointed by that. I remember Penny Russin saying once this incredibly wise thing at a university lecture that has stuck with me, which is that like children's literature always has this safety net of like a benign adult figure like a Dumbledore or an Aslan who will always like swoop in and save the day. But that YA is about realizing that those benign adult godlike figures in your life are just fallible human beings, and they make mistakes just as much as anybody else does.
And I think thrillers in particular lend themselves to that discussion of, oh my God, there is no one like the adult.
Nobody
they don't know what they're
charge.
doing.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. And then as you get older, that's just like, that's only reinforced. And I think what's really interesting is, and again, when you and I were speaking about this, Ellie, we were talking about the fact that people are naturally a bit car crash gawkery, like people sort of, and that's in part what the appeal of the thriller is. You kind of like to see bad stuff happening kind of to other people, as well as the message of the really powerful message of, okay, you can get through this. And I think that's a really interesting tension across reading a thriller of, ooh, something that's not happening to me, thank goodness, but oh wow, the like indomitability of the human spirit. So I'm interested to know, you know, is that, where does that tension come into it when we read gory or dark books?
I mean, look, I do think people are a bit, you know, watching the car crash. We are kind of naturally a bit gawkery, but I don't know if that's because people are like, well, I don't know if the largest part of it is because we sort of are glad that that's happening to somebody else and not to us. I mean, I'm sure that part of that, I'm sure there's some element of that in it, sure. But I also think that it's partly that kind of like, oh my God, something terrible has happened to that person. How are they coping? How would I cope in that situation? Part of it is an assessment, you know, of how would I handle that? And you know, like you read something like The Hunger Games or any other kind of YA book where, you know, any other thriller where the teenagers are thrust into a situation where they have to cope with overpowering odds, or they're being pursued, or there's something terrible is happening to them. And part of you is kind of going, oh, what would I do? Would I pick up my bow and arrow and go out and try and, you know, battle the evildoers? Would I cope as well as the character in this book? Would I, you know, where are my internal resources? So part of it is about teenagers kind of girding themselves for the world, I guess, for what they anticipate happening in the future. And it's good also to give them an opportunity to project their fears onto an imagined scenario where they sort of think, oh, would I have the fortitude to get through that, you know, if I was in that situation? Yeah, I just think in the same way that, you know, when you write YA romance, I remember I was speaking to a group of teenagers at a festival one year, and this was just after my first book came out, Every Breath, and there's a romance component obviously in that series. And I asked the teenagers in the audience, you know, why do we write romance? Why is romance so popular for teenage readers? And this young boy put up his hand and he said, because we want to know what to expect. And I think thrillers, which I thought was really sweet.
It is really sweet.
It is, it's not. But I also think there's an element of that too, applies to thrillers. You know, is this what I can expect? Would I cope as well under these circumstances? What's inside me? What internal resources do I have that would allow me to cope in times of peril? And I think teenagers do think about that. And I think that's why thrillers have a strong appeal for teenagers.
Lily, do you have anything to add?
Only just yes. I agree with all of that, and it's why, like, it's, you know, it's the great thing about literature is it's like it's training wheels for life. It helps you experience all of the big scary things, without actually having to do it. Which is why it's so frustrating when you come across, you know, the occasional gatekeeper who's like, oh, I, you know, don't want my child to read anything with sex in it. And it's like, but wouldn't you rather they found out about sex in like a great positive YA novel where it's just on paper instead of like watching porn on the internet, which they can all do. So I think that literature is so great for that. You know, it is such a great way to be scared. And there's been heaps of research, this is more about younger children, but into the fact that if a young person is reading a book and it's too much and it's too scary, they will put it down and they will walk away. Like, nobody is sitting there getting like lifetime traumatized by books unless it's in like a really fun way, like when I read Lord of the Rings. But yeah, I think that literature, you know, is such a great vehicle that, and particularly for young people who, you know, the world is super scary and the world also has no answers. And the one thing you can guarantee with reading a thriller is that by the time you get to the end, you will have an answer. You're going to know who did it. And that's very, very, like, that gives you a lot of safeness and a lot of comfort, I think.
That's really true. And Sarah?
Yeah, I completely agree with what everybody's been saying. You know, that element of preparedness, you know, feeling like, you know, reading a dark thriller or a dark book in general, it sort of gives you that element of being able to think, what would I do in this situation? And I probably liken it to the way a lot of people have a fascination with true crime. It usually goes hand in hand with people that enjoy reading thrillers. And it's like, you know, it's just this, you can't look away from the spectacle, you know, you can't look away from from a train wreck. And I think it's like when I hear, you know, some kind of horrible crime has been committed and, you know, they've got the perpetrator's name in the news article, and I have to go and Google their face and see what they look like. I don't know why, or I always feel compelled to do this, because for some reason I feel like I just need to try and understand human nature, and that somehow that will help me, you know, by looking at their face, looking in their eyes and just understanding what they look like. And it doesn't really help me, but it's just that whole thing, that obsession that we have with true crime and, you know, being thrilled by something or titillated by something, or, you know, be very interested in sort of dark subject matter, but from the safety of our living rooms. It's sort of like the adrenaline rush of, you know, being scared, but doing it in a very safe situation. So I think probably, yeah, a lot of, when I read a lot of dark stuff when I was a teenager, it was that sort of, that idea of, you know, what would I do? You know, it's like watching horror movies. What would I do if, you know, if they jimmied open that door and I heard them breaking in, and, you know, your mind just turns over these sort of scenarios, and you sort of, and it's just, it's thrill and adrenaline rush, but, and exploring the dark side of human nature, but without having to actually directly be in that situation.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, and it leads me really interestingly into something that a question we received on Twitter from Sarah Ross, who said, "How scary can you go?" Because I mean, you're right. Like we are fascinated with that dark aspect of human nature, and a lot of the time we ask, "Well, would I do that? Would that be my line? Could I do that?" So I'm kind of interested. And so what Sarah said is, "How scary can you go?" I have a low tolerance, but I suspect YA readers may be more resilient. But, and she makes a really great point here, fairy tales can be really horrific once you realize the implications of the story. So where's your cutoff? How far can you guys go? And Sarah, I'll jump back in with you if that's all right.
I think you can go pretty dark. When I was a teenager, I was reading Stephen King and everything else. And again, it's just that teenagers are self-regulating. If it's too dark for them, they'll put it down. If they're a young teen, if they're 13 or something, and the themes are a little bit too full on, they'll know that they don't feel ready for it, and they'll put it aside. It's like my younger son is 13, and when he was 12, he was reading some upper middle grade stuff, or it might have been lower YA, and he just wasn't quite ready for it yet, and he knew just to put the book down and just leave it. The problem is that we do have gatekeepers that, teachers and parents and librarians, and they make recommendations to teens. They help put the books in the teens' hands, or the kids are using their parents' credit card, getting their parent to buy the book online for them, or give it to them for Christmas or their birthday. So there is still that element of gatekeepers there, and so it's kind of an interesting line, because I personally, if we're talking about how far can you go with how dark something can be, and dark as in not just scary, but gruesome or violent or horrific or traumatizing. And so for me personally, and this is not for all writers, but I personally do pull back a little bit, because on gratuitous anything really, because I still want to reach those 12, 13-year-old readers all the way through to adults. And so I try to find a way to write those scenes, whether I have to cut away or just pull back on what I want to do, or find another way to bring in another element that's creepy without it being overly gratuitous or traumatizing in some way, just purely because I personally want to have my book recommended by teachers and librarians and picked up by parents. I don't want kids to not have access to it because of that. But I think that's just storytelling. It's just being clever in the way you craft it. But then there's some much darker books, and they definitely have their place. And I think that it's absolutely fine to go much darker than what I do, or much more gory, full on horror and stuff, because those books have their audience too. But I personally do pull back on it a little bit, but teens don't need me to. I just have other reasons why, and it doesn't compromise the story I'm telling, but it just means that I can reach my audience in the way that I need and want to.
Yeah, that's really fair. And I mean, to be fair, I think, and this isn't to say that there hasn't been scenes from None Shall Sleep and Erasure that haven't stuck with me, but I think I have to be so careful not to give away spoilers for any of the books. I think in some ways, Deep Water, there was aspects to the reveal that and they were completely PG-13, no violence, no gore, but that haunted me even more because of what happened.
Because
it's very hard not to kind of give a spoiler away there. I'm torn between Ellie and Lily, because I know both of you have looked up some really horrific stuff online.
Yeah.
Ellie, because you've done FBI most recently.
Okay.
With serial killers.
How far can you go? How scary can you go with YA? Look, I've discovered that honestly, the best way for me to write any book is just to write what I want to write, and then worry about whether or not I've gone too far later. And typically your editors will pull you up if you're writing for, a publishing house. So you can have discussions about that later. And my experience is that I tend not to back away from stuff that's horrifying. I mean, but I think, Alice, we've had these discussions before about there were things that I didn't want to include in None Shall Sleep because I had a character who had gone through trauma. And part of the response to the book had been people saying to me, oh, you know, why can't we see more on the page about what happened to this character before the book started to, you know, give us some context for her character. And because she'd been kidnapped by a serial killer and, you know, and people were curious about that. And I really didn't want to put more of that on the page because I felt like it was gratuitous and it wasn't relevant to what was happening in the story, you know, apart from the fact that she was reacting like a trauma survivor would. But yeah, I decided to preserve her privacy, I guess, and show only enough that the reader could build up their own image of what had happened to her, so that so that the character didn't have to reveal all her trauma. I think there's a unfortunate history in crime and thrillers of women, you know, being brutalized or victimized, and I didn't want to fall into that. And I also felt that for a YA novel, it might have been too much to put too much of it on the page. And I also feel like we see it all the time. We see it in the news, we see it on TV, we see it in, you know, we hear about reports about women being, you know, going through trauma and violence all the time. So that was something specific to this novel that I didn't really want to go there. But then, you know, I did go into some graphic detail during other events later in the story.
Yeah, and yeah, I told you that it was that has haunted me a little bit, I must say.
But I also sort of feel like there were a lot of events that I kind of describe, but I leave a lot up to the reader's imagination. I mean, I really do feel like teenagers are pretty intelligent readers. They're also highly imaginative, and they can imagine something that's way worse than anything you can write on the page. So it's not always necessary to completely pull the curtain back. You can intimate, you can include enough breadcrumbs for the reader to form their own picture of what's happened, or, you know, what the character is seeing without describing every spatter of blood, you know. So so for some of the things I did pull back a little, but that was more just because I wanted to trust the reader imagination and intelligence, I guess, and let the reader can go there in their own mind, and yeah, they can take themselves there if they want to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't necessarily feel like you have to pull back that much, but I sometimes do for dramatic effect, or because I want to preserve something for the reader to imagine or look after a character, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it feels almost like circling back to the question of the car crash. Are you looking there because you're thinking, and are you depicting the gore and the violence because,
Yeah.
you know, what would I do? Is this integral to the plot, or is it a gratuity? And I think that's a really nice guiding principle. And Lily, I also in Erasure Initiative, right near the end, there's one scene, you know, the one I'm talking about. Sorry to everyone who hasn't read the book. This is just this is the worst. That also that has. I'm just kind of like, how would I do that? No way. What? Yeah. Where's your line for including and excluding content or graphic stuff?
Yeah, there are things that I don't want to write about, but not because I don't feel like it's appropriate for the audience, but just because I genuinely don't want to go there for me. So I won't write about suicide, and I don't think I want to write about sexual violence either. Like, those are just two topics that I don't want to go there. I don't want to spend time with that, you know, for my own reasons. In terms of gatekeepers, I think that the gatekeepers are far more worried about sex and swearing than they are about violence, as they are with television. You know, it comes back to our film classification, you know, which, you know, can't have two people kissing, but, you know, you can have somebody being beheaded, and that's fine for children to see. And I feel like that double standard, and, you know, being the parent of a 5-year-old, I see that double standard all the time. I'm like, there's no way my kid should be able to watch this. And even though it's a cartoon, it's still really, really violent. And so I don't think that they're I don't think that those gatekeepers particularly care about gore or violence. I think that it is all like a prudishness about sex, which I find utterly baffling. I quite enjoy writing gory scenes personally. That scene you're referring to, and there's another one in the middle of the book, I really like it. I like doing the research to figure exactly like, where would that blood go? How much of it would there be? I enjoy that quite a lot.
I did actually have to research how far blood would spray if you slit someone's carotid, and then I was like, but if you slit all the way around the throat, wouldn't it just, one would spray out and the other side would go just straight down? Yeah, and it was like 3 hours of research for 2 sentences. But now I know. Yeah, it's actually an interesting point you make about what do gatekeepers have issue with, and I think back to Jay Kristoff and Amy Kaufman have said a few times they open Illuminae files with like 3,000 deaths and no one bats an eyelid, and all of their curse words are blanked out for sensibility reasons. And they're like, how has no one said that this is a traumatic, horrific thing for children to be exposed to? Well, I mean, it's a completely different conversation, but it's an interesting one nevertheless. And I think similarly, like some of the because Sarah, Deepwater has some very psychologically, I mean, all 3 of the books have psychologically disturbing aspects, but no one sort of is as worried about psychological violence as they are about physical violence, which is sort of, psychological violence can happen over the internet. It can happen to anyone. Physical violence, you sort of need to be in the same room as them. So it's a really interesting point. And we have a question also from Twitter from Belinda Grant, who, and I think this is it plays into the questions of gore and when you bring it in and when you don't. She said, I'd love to hear more about how you ramp up tension as the book progresses. Are there particular formulas or plot structures that suit writing thrillers? And I'm going to tack onto that a question which kind of is coming from what you were saying, Lily, about the emotional side and the emotional immediacy to YA. And how do you balance the emotional immediacy and the emotional, I guess, subplot with the thriller plot that's going on? So I'll start with Lily because my question's tacked on with what you said.
Yeah, it's I personally believe that with something like a thriller that has to be so plot driven, I prefer to use like a super generic plot structure. I want the most classic structure possible because I need the reader to be comfortable on the ride. Like, I don't want the reader to be noticing the structure of the story. I don't want the reader to be thinking, this is a very clever use of flashbacks or whatever. Like, I just want them to be totally immersed in it. And I think that the best way to do that is to use something really classic, you know, to use a classic 3-act structure, to use Hero's Journey, to use Save the Cat, you know, whatever one you choose. And so I usually start there. And for me, character and plot are always woven in very, very closely together. And I always start with those two sort of really, really enmeshed. And so the narrative tension always comes from, and with Erasure Initiative, I was very, very sort of deliberate in this, that in every chapter, I wanted there to be a really big question at the beginning of the chapter. By the end of the chapter, that question or a question gets answered, but in the answering of the question, it raises a new, bigger question that, you know, that steps the plot up. And it was quite difficult to do that in Erasure Initiative because at the beginning of the book, nobody has any memory. So it's very hard to make people like invested in their stories. And like, Sarah and Ellie, your books both rely so much on your characters having that backstory, that history with these other people and these other experiences. I didn't have any of that. They have nothing. They're just total blank slates. So it is then in the learning about who they are that has to create more drama, so that everything that they learn about themselves creates more emotional complexity. So everything had to be stepping up, and there could never be a moment where they stop doing that. And if they did, then you've lost, you know, your tension thread has snapped and you've got to start all over again.
I mean, that's an interesting, I really like the question leading to another question. That's that's really clever. And I'm just thinking, because and literally it's fresh in my head because I was typing up what you and I were discussing, Sarah, which is, you said the middle is the point that you never want to flag, and you work really hard to make sure that you keep pushing through. So can you speak to how do you keep ramping up the tension and making sure that you have that nice balance between plot and character?
Yeah, I'm quite similar to Lily in terms of the characters do drive the plot to a degree, because their motivations for doing things, opens up a new can of worms every chapter. So, when you're answering one question, you've got three more, that sort of thing. So, with characters, it will sort of naturally, organically keep ramping up like that. But in terms of how I actually structure, I probably wouldn't use, I don't use like a full-on beat sheet or anything like that. It's very much more instinct for me. I have a certain number of scenes when I'm starting to brainstorm the story. I get scenes that come to me and I think, oh, this is a good scene, I'm going to put something like this in. And then I'll choose how much weight I give it and whereabouts I'll place it in the story. So if I think it might naturally need to come in the first third of the story, I obviously won't give it as much tension, or I might move more quickly through it as compared to something that's a lot more pivotal to the climax in the last third. I do definitely still always make sure I've got an inciting incident. I do like to make sure I kind of get to that all is lost moment, and then those sort of hallmarks of the 3-act structure. But yeah, in terms of actually ramping up the tension, I think for me, I tend to write the scenes, and then it's just a lot of stuff happens in revision. So I'm constantly revising as I'm going. But where I feel like something, I don't know, it's just like instinct. You can tell where you need something shocking to happen next. And it's really, I know that's, sorry, Belinda, because I know that's not really answering your question, but I think it's not something that you necessarily learn on paper. You just, and it changes with every story. So but for me, I think, look at those scenes. Don't sort of force your characters into doing what you want them to do. Wait and see, write a scene and then see what you think would naturally come next. And often, you think, oh, well, I would do this, but my character's going to do this instead, and create a whole bunch of other complications. And so, and that's how, getting to know your character really well is really important, because their whole history, as Lily was saying, if they have a history that you know about, it will play into the decisions that they make, which are not necessarily the decisions that the readers will make, and often completely frustrates readers. But it is very true to what that character will do. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily always a smart idea or a good idea, in terms of what readers want. But it's very true to that character. So yeah, I think probably a lot of revision helps with the pacing and ramping up the tension.
It also brings to mind something Isabel Carmody said. I have no idea where, I have no idea when, but she said, if you're bored, how can you expect the reader to be engaged? And I feel like as the author, you are such a good litmus test. And chapters that I've revised that have been some of my best have been ones where I'm like, oh, I'm bored. Why would I keep reading this? Yeah. And I think that's especially, but when you take it with the character, that's a writer gem, everybody. I reckon note that down if you're looking for a little masterclass tonight. Ellie, what would you say?
I am going to 100% agree with that statement, because every time I find myself writing a chapter and kind of like, things are starting to get a bit okay, then I know that I've lost the reader, basically. And Lily, I totally remember that time when you were writing the Erasure Initiative and you were like, how the heck am I going to do this with all of these people who have no memories? How am I going to construct this? And you were pulling your hair out at one stage and then you figured it out, which was really good. I used to be like Sarah, you were saying you used to just follow your instinct, and to some extent I do that. And I certainly started off with a lot of my writing doing that. I didn't do that with None Shall Sleep. I plotted it out. I did exactly what Lily said. I used a completely traditional structure. I used 3-act structure. I followed it religiously. I also used a lot of hero's journey. And in terms of the emotional immediacy of the characters, or connecting the emotional tension with the story, I actually kept a track. I did like an emotional arc tracker. So I basically had these kind of, sheets where like, oh, now the story is going to rise and the tension is going to lift here, and now the emotional journey from my character will be like this. So I can distract myself for hours with those sorts of little charts and things like that, not actually write the book. But yeah, look, I did find it incredibly helpful to keep track of this and to track it really, really deliberately all the way through. Look, the other thing is, just before I started writing None Shall Sleep, I was speaking to a friend, C.S. Picard, who's written a number of excellent books, and she was talking to me about narrative tension and a strategy that she uses for narrative tension. And so basically the idea is that at the start of each chapter, you pique the reader's interest with something. And then for the rest of that chapter, you have to withhold that, withhold the gratification of the reader for as long as you can. And then by the end of the chapter, you gratify the reader, you give them a reward. But whatever you give them has to create new tension for the next chapter. So like Lily was saying, it's like ask a question, wait a long time, answer the question, but then provide something that immediately jumps into a new question, which is going to be answered next. And you don't just do that for each chapter, you do that for all of the arcs as well. So Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 has the same structure. Narrative, peak narrative interest, withhold, and then, gratify the reader at the end. So that was something that I actually deliberately applied, and I think it worked really well. Definitely using that again. So yeah, I think you're playing around all the time as a writer. You're always learning new things, and your craft is constantly developing. I mean, I'm a better writer now than I was when my first book was published, I hope. But yeah, you never. I'm 9 books in. Lily's 14 books in. Is that right?
It's actually 15, but sure.
Wow, 15. Far out. I mean, and I'll still be learning things when I've written 15 books, when I've written 20 books. You just never stop learning. And I'm constantly reading other people's books too to find out.
And thinking, crap, how did they do that?
That's right. And then like, oh, I've got an issue. I'm trying to resolve a situation in this book. How did other people do it? And then you go to other people and you read their books and you sort of think, oh, right, I see now. So yeah, it's incredibly helpful to read other people's writing, and obviously you can't copy what they've done, but you can emulate and use similar strategies and use craft tips that you've picked up from other people's books. I mean, other people's books have been my best teacher throughout the course of my career.
Massive amount of snobbery about that. Like there's a lot of, there's that idea of like, a writer writes their book entirely and they don't get edited, and it's just their singular work of genius. And I've heard a lot of like, like snobby or grown-up writers say, I don't read at all while I'm writing because I don't want anything to influence my blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that's how you do it. Like you do it by looking at how other people did it and figuring out how you're going to do that your way.
Yes.
And it's an homage as well.
Yes.
Like it's an homage, like it is a love letter to something that inspired you.
Yeah.
Mark Ronson gave a TED talk on sampling in music, and he was like, it sounds like a deviation, but it's not. He was like, it's looked down upon to sample in songs, but I think it's actually a way to say thank you to the music that we loved that much that we don't think we can do better than it. We're including it. It's a beautiful way of paying homage to something that resonated and struck a chord in you. Sorry, I had to jump in.
Right.
But it's really interesting because I know all three of you planned the Jesus out of these three books behind me. And Annie W on Twitter asked, what percentage of time do you say that you split between planning and the actual writing? And Sarah, I know you planned a lot, so I'll start with you.
I do plan a lot. I would have no idea, though, about the time breakdown. What I do know is that books live in my head for years before I start writing them. I brainstorm a lot. I write random scenes, random notes, random pages of dialogue between characters that I don't even really know who they are yet. But then when I do sit down and plot, I do tend to, what I tend to do is I like to come up now. This is what I do now. This is not necessarily what I did on the first books that I wrote before Small Spaces. But as Ellie says, you learn something different with every book that you write, and none of them are the same, the way you approach them. But I now tend to come up with a strong premise that I can say in one or two lines and think, is that a book that I would want to pick up? Does that sound strong? Has that got a big hook? And so I write that down, and then I start to toy with, okay, well, what would that mean? Who would the characters be? Why would they be like this? Why would they do this? And so I start sort of fanning out from there, almost charting outwards in all these different directions, and just do a huge big brainstorm. And then when I start to pull the information together more, I'm starting to get to know who characters are and that sort of thing. All of this will happen before I really write very much. But then when I do start writing, sometimes I like to just write chapter 1 or 2, 1 and 2, and just to get to know the sound of my protagonist's voice, just to see what's their situation, where's this opening, and that might not even make it to the final book. But once I've done that, then pretty quickly I start to understand what my story is and where it's going, and I start to plot out chapters. Again, I write random scenes and think, okay, and then I start to put them in sort of virtual index cards. How am I going to put these in order? Where will these things come in? What are the order of all of these scenes? And then once I start doing that, and I've got this kind of very broad overview, I have to figure out what the ending is before I get stuck into the drafting. So I cannot, and I always say this in every interview that I do, that I always have to come up with the ending first before I really do much drafting, because otherwise I stall and I don't know where I'm going. So that for me is sort of, so there is a lot of work, but I'm constantly working on that plot outline, even as I'm drafting. And then I'll get to a point, usually when I get through about maybe the first third of the book written, I start to create a color chart of all of my chapters, and I like to color code them if they are, written dual point of view or in a non-linear narrative structure. It helps me keep track of the scenes and where I'm feeding the information and where the clues are going to appear, and in who's, which, if it's dual point of view, whose chapter is going to reveal what. And so there's a lot of work that goes into that sort of complicated mystery, I suppose. And then when I get to the drafting part, I'm often moving things around again. So, and then normally once I get to about 50% of the way through the book, I kind of know what I'm doing. And then the rest, I just play it out and I write it out and then go back to the beginning and then revise it all again. So for me, it's just kind of always these moving parts, but a lot of the plotting does happen before I really start writing.
That is so detailed. Like, I'm just blown away. I'm sorry, I'm just like trying to fit it all in my head. That is amazing. And I'm going to move on to you, Ellie, because I know that you've said that you have been a pantser in the past, but for you planning pantsing's a bit on a spectrum, and everyone sort of does a little bit of everything.
I think it very much depends on the project. I think your style adapts for every project. Not all projects are the same. Sometimes you'll plot them out extensively, sometimes you won't. Certainly the last couple of books that I've I've plotted out more extensively, and the first 3 books I ever wrote, I just wrote from by the seat of my pants. But that doesn't always you end up having to retcon a lot of things. So you get to the end and you're like, oh, hang on, in order for this finale to work, I have to go back 50 pages and write in, and here comes a truck, and then the truck appears, So you do end up doing a lot of fixing upping in the editing stages when you're a pantser. But when you're plotting, I've just kind of gotten into it more with my ability to track the emotional arcs, because I find the emotional arcs and the emotional journey of the story is really important. But it's the other thing is I have a problem with writing extensive plots, because like I said before, I can get really distracted by all the charts and all of the color coding, and I've got an extensive collection of colored Post-it notes and things like that. But I could do that for hours and not actually write the book. So I'm kind of going through the process now of brainstorming ideas for a new book, and it's just throwing everything up in the air and seeing where my instinct is to in terms of ideas, and then I'll write little bits and pieces of it. And I think Ursula Le Guin used to say it's quilting. It's like a quilting experience where you write little bits and pieces of the story, or little insights will come into the character, or you'll get a couple of lines of dialogue, and then I write all of that stuff down, and then I'll probably plot out more extensively and then figure out where everything's just going to fit in. So that's sort of seemed to be a way that I usually work now. But again, the next book I write could be completely different. Might change altogether.
I really want to ask about a sequel to None Shall Sleep. I'm gonna leave it
right now. I'm happy to answer that question later.
Please. Thank you. And Lily, what percentage of your time is planning to writing and your process therein?
Yeah, I don't think I can say either, because it's all kind of enmeshed. For me, I usually, like Sarah, sort of start out with lots of really big conceptual stuff. I figure out what the hook is, who my characters are, what they want, what the really broad plot is going to be. And at that point is when I'm doing a lot of research as well, which I really enjoy. And a lot of the story is generated from that research, because you think like, that's cool, I want to put that in. How can I do that? And sort of manipulate your story to sort of fit those things that you really want to talk about or write about. And then usually at some point in that process, the opening image and the closing image to the story will come into my head, and I usually am pretty firm on what those two are from the beginning. Like with the Erasure Initiative, I knew the opening image and I knew the closing image as well. I knew exactly what the closing image needed to be, but I had absolutely no idea how I was going to get them to that point. And so then I do my planning, whether or not I'm using a beat sheet or, Hero's Journey or whatever it is that I'm using. And sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just go more general 3-act structure. But certainly for Erasure Initiative, I just used a flat out, straight, generic, 20-point beat sheet, which was very helpful because I know that my books are usually 20 chapters. And so I write a list of 1 to 20 and I put in the midpoint, I put in my inciting incident, I put in my act turning points, I put in my climax and my resolution. And then there's usually only a few more to fill in. So you sort of add those other ones in as well. I have note cards and I have, color-coded note cards because, we're writers, we like color-coded stationery. And so I have, my structural ones, and then I have other cards, like wild card cards of things that I just really want to put in the book. Like, like I really want to have a kissing scene where this happens, or I really want her to be able to wear a fancy dress. And that's something, or like, this is a joke that I've thought of that I want to go in the book. And so I have them. And so then I can figure out like what bit they go next to. And with Erasure Initiative, because there was lots of sort of supplemental materials in between each chapter, I had all of those on a different color as well. So I could figure out sort of where they went. And then at some point I have to slap myself, in the face and start writing the book. And we'll usually start with that opening image that I have. We'll write the opening chapter. And from then on, I try to write chronologically, but I usually don't, because I will usually just get so obsessed with one scene that I really, really am burning to write, that could be anywhere in the book. And so I will go away and write that bit, because that's how you get over writer's block, is you go and write the bit that you really want to write. And generally when I'm doing a scene, you know, when I'm doing a chapter, I'll figure out what are the scenes that need to go in this chapter, and then what are the beats that need to happen in each of those scenes, and I will write those down. And that's something I started doing, I think with Down the Sublime, or maybe Erasure maybe After the Lights Go Out, because I realized it's a lot easier if you figure out what's going to happen in the scene and then you try to make it sound good. And that before I was trying to do both of those things at the same time, and it's much harder and your brain doesn't work as well. And then at some point, I will often go back to structure and tinker with it a lot as I go, as I figure out, you know, where the tension is lagging, or I just do more research and come up with more cool things to put in. And at some point, I'm left with about 20% of the book that I've been putting off writing. And those are the scenes that I know are too boring, and I need to find ways to make them more interesting. And it's like, you know, could they be having this argument while, I don't know, jumping out of a plane or fleeing from Nazis, or, you know, doing something fun and exciting to make it interesting to me and hopefully to a reader.
That is what I always find fascinating, is whenever you ask someone's writing process, even when people are like, no, I plan, it's always different. Every writing process is different for every single person, and it's so fascinating. And especially when you have people come in and be like, no, this is how you should, you know, you should use the Pomodoro technique, or you should write every single day. Oh, and it's like, oh, what if the person's brain just doesn't work like that? It's no, but it's so.
Or what if you have 4 children and you just can't write every day? Or what if you have a job and you can't write every day? You know, I mean, I just really think that kind of prescriptive, you know, rules of writing, I just really just throw that crap out the window. You know, you have to make it work for you. Yeah, it is. But it's also, you know, it's just not practical. And it's kind of part of the whole snobbery of writing, like you were saying before, Lily, you know, like, oh, artists work a certain way. You know, really, it's not like that. Writing, it works for you the way you make it work for you. And, you know, and I write at different times of the day, for different lengths of time. You know, I use different strategies to get the words down now than I did when I first started. In another couple of years, it'll be different again. You know, when all my children have grown up and left home, I'll have more time. You know, you've got to adapt for your own situation, your own circumstance.
And you're in fun.
Yeah.
It has to be fun. It has to be enjoyable.
Absolutely.
So I realize that we are now at 8 o'clock. I have one and a half new questions, and I was thinking I'll put this on the Twitter, but I will ask this instead, because this is from Anna Waitley, and she asked it over Instagram, and she said, "How do you sleep at night?"
Like a baby. No, I like, genuinely, I mean, not always, but I think, you know, like, I don't want to say writing is therapy, because, you know, that diminishes the actual very important work of therapy, but there is an extent to which, like, I wrote my first thriller, which was Boundless Sublime, just after I had Banjo, and I had a newborn baby, and I had written 6 romantic comedies before that. I've never written anything super dark before. And having a baby is about as existential as you can get, because you are exhausted, and you haven't slept for months, and your body is like a disaster.
Lily, I don't have children yet, so don't glamorize it too much for me, please.
But there's, and like, I was almost about to get to the part where, like, there's also a lot of joy and you're really excited and you love it. Great. But you're just also totally overwhelmed because you don't know what you're doing. And that was the point where I started writing Boundless Sublime, and I wrote it like on my phone while breastfeeding, because like I needed to get it out so much, and it was so cathartic for me to be able to pour all of the darkness and frustration and anxiety that I had into that. And it kind of left me sort of free to just like enjoy being a mum and to enjoy my baby, and which is not to say that it wasn't, you know, like sunshine and rainbows all the time, but I do feel like it was an outlet for a darkness, which particularly I think new mothers are not supposed to feel. Like, you're not supposed to be like I'm exhausted and I just want everything to go away. You're supposed to be like, from some kind of commercial and be glowing and everything is great. But it is very frustrating, and it gives you a lot of anxiety and all of those sorts of things. And so to have that outlet for me was incredible. And I realized how much I really enjoyed writing dark. I thought that I would find it depressing. I thought that I would find it, I thought that it would bring me down. But in fact, it was the opposite. It was like I can put all of my darkness in the book, and then I can just walk away and enjoy my family. So I sleep very well at night. Sorry,
Anna. Sarah?
Yes, I sleep really well too, Anna. I think probably for me, because I do a lot of my writing, or brainstorming or planning and stuff in the evenings. So, I always have a session after dinner where I come in and I'll either draft something or research or anything like that. And honestly, by the time I go to bed, which is, normally my bedtime is 2 a.m., I'm out like a light because my brain's exhausted. I don't even think I dream anymore. If I do, I don't remember it. My brain just says, Sarah, you need to rest now. And I used to have my Fitbit used to track my sleep. And I used to be able to look at the charts and see how quickly I fell asleep, because some people, they toss and turn and they wake up a lot during the night, and there's little blips on their chart showing where they might have rolled over or got disturbed or woken up, had these wakeful moments throughout the night. And mine is, I would fall asleep after 2 minutes and I would just solid flat, like just sleep for 6 hours, and then I was up again. And so when I go to bed and I sleep, I'm just gone now. Whereas when I was younger, I used to have a lot of dreams. I used to get insomnia, all that sort of thing. So I think I'm probably just at a point in my life now where my brain just knows I need to rest for that 6 hours every night. And the only thing that does freak me out a little bit though is that sometimes I'm, when you go in these YouTube wormholes at 1 a.m. and I'm researching some completely freaky thing that springboards into some other weird, scary thing, and I'm creeping myself out, but that's while I'm awake, and then I go to bed and I'm zonked out, and it doesn't bother me at all. So I still sleep really well. I don't get nightmares. So yeah, I think it's probably just because I have that, that 6 hours a day, and it's just solid. So my brain just says rest now, and then I do.
Sorry, I'm kind of like stuck on the 2 a.m. bedtime.
Me too.
Oh, always.
I can't. Yeah, I would die now. Oh, and look, I like staying up. I'm a natural night owl, but I just get too tired during the day. There's just too much happening. So yeah, but I do sit up till at least midnight, and then wake up automatically. It's a couple of hours, 6 hours later. I'm a 6 hour cycle person too. If you've got kids and that sort of tends to happen over the years. I sleep fine. Don't have any problems with it. All good. I don't care.
Stephen King says it's therapy. Stephen King unabashedly, he's like, well, I mean,
cheaper than therapy, right? That was always his line. I mean, look, it's not so much therapy, because I agree with Lily. I mean, there's a whole different ball game, but it's a place where I know I can completely de-stress in the writing. And it's, if I haven't written for a couple of days, and sometimes, because I work as a teacher during the week, so I've got a couple of days of work during the week where I just really don't have time to sit down and do writing work. And then after about 2 days in a row like that, I become a cranky person to live with. So, I've found, particularly during COVID, it's been really important that I make a couple of hours where I can just go out to the shed and get away from people and just sit and concentrate on the work. It has been more complicated during lockdown to do that, but it's really been important for my mental health that I get that time. And also, I'm on deadline, so I've got to get the job done. But I'm very much a proponent of the whole, writing is a job, just like any other job, just like laying brick. You have to show up, you have to do the work. And it fortunately coincides for me with a great feeling of peace and happiness after I finish doing the work. So I can relax. Yeah.
But you're in a different conceptual world as well. And especially when you're in lockdown, it is one of the only ways that you can actually leave the house.
Yeah.
Which is it's very special. I think it's so special. And even editing, which I loathe passionately. But even editing, you are immersing yourself into that world again. So that's so lovely. So the final question, and we've had this a couple of times. So one is Bees82 on Instagram, and then the second was Siobhan. So B said, I'd love to know what each of the author's favorite thrillers are. And Siobhan asked specifically, what thrillers did you love as a teenager? I'll give you some thinking time.
Well, I can answer that one to Siobhan because she knows that when I was a teenager, we've talked about this on Twitter, that I love Christopher Pike books, and she did too. That was something that I got into as a teenager in a big way. As for now, it's hard. I always struggle with these questions about favourite books because I don't really have favourites, but I could say that the ones that got me into writing psychological thrillers, I read them and I just fell in love, because before that I had written a mystery and I had written a YA contemporary. The mystery ended up turning into Deep Water. The contemporary has not seen the light of day yet, but it will. But it's what got me actually into writing psychological thriller, though, was an adult book that I read was Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. And I just loved it. It was so dark. It was so arresting, and the people were so flawed and horrible. And I just thought, this is exhilarating. I loved that book. I still love that book. And also I read Rebecca James's Sweet Damage, which is her second book. So Sweet. Have I got the names right? Beautiful Malice, I think, is the first one. And I read that one second. But Sweet Damage was the one that I read first. And I loved that. I loved that psychological thriller. So they would be probably two of my favourites. But I have lots of other favourite books. But they were two that really kick-started me into writing psychological thrillers.
Lily, I saw you go to your bookshelf.
Yeah.
Anyone who has not read Victor Kelleher's Del.
Oh, yes!
It is the scariest.
Oh, my God.
What is that?
Del by Victor Kelleher.
Oh, my God. Yeah.
He is one of the finest writers, and his books are impossible to find now.
Oh, what a shame. He's also just a really nice guy. The first panel I ever moderated was with Victor and another author who I will not name because they were terrible and just gave me nothing. And every question I asked, they responded with a yes or a no. And Victor was so generous and gave so many beautiful anecdotes. And I'm sure I wasn't doing a very good job because it was my first one and I had no idea what I was doing. But he was great. Anyway, this is a really terrifying book about a girl whose little brother starts to behave very, very strangely, and it is very unclear whether he is possessed, whether he by a dead person, whether he has been his body has been taken over by an alien, whether there is something psychologically sort of broken in him. It is utterly terrifying. I'm still scared by it.
I'm going to look that up. I haven't read that because I read, when you mentioned Victor Kelleher, I remember reading Taronga.
Yeah.
Years ago when I was a kid, and that was really engrossing. But I was trying to rack my brain because I was thinking, what did I read when I was a teenager? And I couldn't really remember anything. But then I remembered John Wyndham wrote a book called Chucky years and years ago, and his books, The Chrysalids, they're all science fiction. The Midwich Cuckoos. I read all those books when I was really young, but I read Chucky, and they made it into a TV series. The BBC had created a TV series.
Yeah, I remember that TV series.
And I was just completely transfixed by it. This was when I was a kid, so it must have made a lasting impression. Because I still remember. And he wrote another book called Trillions, which is also this kind of end of the world kind of science fiction thriller. So that was interesting. But then, in my early 20s, I read Mindhunter by John Douglas, which, steered me into things like Silence of the Lambs. So Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon, probably my two favourite thrillers. And, you know, I also read so much Stephen King as a teenager, like heaps of Stephen King. And yeah, although, you know, the difference between, we could get into a long conversation about the difference between like the thriller story engine and a horror story engine, but because they are different. But they certainly do both create that kind of pulse pounding, you know, edge of your seat, anxiety. Oh my God, what are the characters going to do? How are they going to cope? Yeah, that sort of stuff still happens within both horror and thriller. But yeah, you've thrown me right back now, Lily. Chucky was, I'm still remembering the silver eyes, all the creepy stuff that was involved in that series and in that book.
Wow. And I just want to add, what I think is really, really cool is that in like 10, maybe 15 years, there'll be a panel on YA thrillers or thrillers, and the authors who will themselves be teenagers now, when they ask what were the thrillers you loved as a teenagers, will probably nominate your books.
Oh,
That would be really nice.
So I think that's so lovely that it's just a really nice thought. I reckon is definitely going to happen. So, especially given half my students, I'm going to shove these books into their hands. I don't care if you're scared, read it. I love my students very dearly. I care about their emotional well-being, provided it doesn't, you know, go against what I think they need to read. Okay. So yeah, I think that's definitely the note on which we should end tonight, with the future favorite books of the future authors, current favorite books of the future thriller authors. Thank you so much to all three of you for your time. We are all Victorian in this panel. Ellie happily has just come out of like the version. Is it stage? Well, you guys were in stage 4, weren't you?
Yeah, we were in stage 3, but we've just dropped down to
Right. Yay. So she can now go outside.
Yeah.
Sarah, Lily, and myself can go outside for 2 hours a day. Lucky us.
Yeah.
So it has been a real delight speaking with all three of you. And thank you so much. And because I've been watching the YouTube comments coming through, and so many people are saying thank you so much for the generosity with which you're sharing your processes and your insights. So thank you very, very much. We do have the nominated bookstores from all of you. What I think I'll do is I'll pop them up in a tweet on the Oz Authors Online page either tonight or tomorrow, to support the local bookstores that we love to shine a spotlight on. But just from everyone on the Twitter thread, too much social interaction, too many people. It's not what I'm used to. From everyone on the YouTube comments that have been coming in, and from myself as well as the Oz Authors Online team, thank you so much. And if you haven't read any of these books, or if there's even one you haven't read, I strongly, strongly recommend. I read all three of them in quite quick succession, and I loved them all. So thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. Make sure you tune in next week for Charlie Archbold's launch of Indigo Owl, which is also on Thursday. Beautiful.
Thank you, Alice.
Thanks heaps, Alice.
You're welcome.
Bye, guys.
Bye.